Good evening, everyone. My name is David Elwood. I'm Dean at the Harvard Kennedy School here. Welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. It is truly my pleasure to welcome all of you to help us celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Carr Center for Human Rights. It really has been a remarkable 10 years. And welcome also during, the timing is perfect because we're also in the midst of a week throughout the university where we're celebrating public service in its many forms and many ways. So again, welcome and thank you to be here. It has been an amazing 10 years. I think that those people that were involved in the founding so much, particularly Greg Carr, but many others that are in this audience, would have had a hard time envisioning all that has happened since the center was officially founded in 1999 and really under the leadership of Michael Ignatieff and Samantha Power. Its focus at the time was on exploring the problems of state sovereignty and the ethical implications of military interventions in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And some of those issues continue in great intensity to this day. The center has ever since had programs in a wide range of areas ranging from social psychology to conflict escalation to American exceptionalism, civil society, organizational effectiveness, and the like. The center's current programs are the focus of human rights and social movements, ranging from mass atrocity response operations, measurement in human rights, the Initiative to Stop Trafficking, National Security and Human Rights, the Latin American Initiative, and very timely, state building and human rights in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it has truly been blessed with some of the most remarkable human beings as our directors. Michael Ignatieff has published widely on human rights as a philosophical and normative problem, on American exceptionalism and torture. Oh yeah, and by the way, now he's head of the Liberal Party in Canada, and indeed, he was due to be with us here tonight, but unfortunately his duties there have prevented him from being with us, though he's very sorry not to be here. Samantha Power helped shape debates about genocide prevention and the concept of responsibility to protect, the role of the United Nations through the life of Sergio Vieira del Mio, and of course is a Pulitzer Prize winner. Sarah Sewell has transformed the way the United States military thinks about counterinsurgency and military operations to prevent mass atrocities. And of course, most recently, Rory Stewart has led the center in a new direction to consider the nuanced, on-the-ground problems of interventions through his extensive knowledge and experience of Afghanistan and Iraq. It's been attracting leading human rights practitioners and scholars and fellows over the years, including the current Department of State Policy Planning Anne-Marie Slaughter, Canadian General Romero Dallaire, and many, many others. Indeed, Roy Stewart was a fellow here some years back, and indeed, the first time I met Roy Stewart was at Bartley's Burger Cottage. We just happened to sit down at the same table as he was here. A wonderful thing. And also, I want to praise the extraordinary work of the staff. There's a remarkable group of people that have dedicated big parts of their lives and their ideas to really help the center become what it is today. So the Kennedy School is really quite honored to have the center here, and is that the center serves as a major research hub and leading the way for practical, serious, but thoughtful and very, very concrete ideas and things going forward. And so I want to now talk about Greg Carr. We're very glad to have Greg Carr with us today, and there is simply no question that the reason we have Human Rights Center at the Harvard Kennedy School is because of Greg Carr. At the time, human rights in general was kind of an extension of the study of international affairs, and Greg, along with Samantha Power, felt that to truly give students the ability to think effectively about public policy, they had to see it through a human rights lens. And it was important to create a center dedicated to just that work. And because of that vision and Greg's generosity behind it, a generation of students and faculty and practitioners and fellows has been able to learn, to research, and to apply policies that really have changed the world. It's public service writ worldwide. Now, Greg is a former telecommunications entrepreneur who founded several companies before resigning from his service there on for-profit boards and the like to dedicate himself to philanthropy and humanitarian activities. In addition to his great work with the Carr Center, Greg has founded and been involved in a great many activities, including having founded the Museum of Idaho in his home state, the largest museum in Idaho that focuses on the state's cultural and natural history. He does major conferences on literature, and most recently, through his nonprofit foundation, Greg signed a 30-year agreement in 2006 with the government of Mozambique to restore the country's flagship national park, Gorongosa. And it's truly been a labor of intensity and love, and it's a visionary park in the sense it's not only about restoring a park, but restoring a community, to think of it as a hub of development and future for an entire population. The project entails science research, conservation of the ecosystem, economic development through ecotourism, social development through of the traditional communities located near the park, and the like. He's on the board of many nonprofits, and I'm especially pleased to note that he is a graduate of this school. He received his MPP in 1986. So it is my pleasure to introduce, ladies and gentlemen, Greg Carr.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Dean Elwood. In 1998, as Dean Elwood mentioned, I had the great pleasure of spending a lot of time with Graham Allison and Samantha Power, and we asked ourselves the question, should there be a Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School? In other words, were there big unanswered research questions to which a serious research university should turn itself? Alternatively, was human rights a settled issue? In other words, does everybody already agree upon it? We had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have our own Bill of Rights. Every country in the world, almost in their constitution, rights are enshrined. So if there's general agreement on the topic, then perhaps it's an issue for the NGOs. It's an issue for the watch organizations. In other words, go around the world and when rights are violated, make it known. So to answer this question, Graham and Samantha and I spent about a year reading in the human rights literature. And I became particularly intrigued with the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think that most people in this room, I'm sure, know the story that between 1946 and 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the commissions for the United Nations to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as a part of that process, she sent a letter to Mahatma Gandhi, and she said to him, what do you think should be included in a Universal Declaration of Rights? And when I heard about this, I became really intrigued. I thought, this is going to be so exciting to see what he said. I mean, here's a man who spent his life fighting for rights for hundreds of millions of people. Surely he's going to come back with a sweeping statement of all the rights that we need to have. But that's not what he did. He wrote back to the committee, and he suggested that they call it a Universal Declaration of Rights and Responsibilities. And he didn't mention a single right. And he said, make sure you include a list of responsibilities that people have to give back to their society. And that was a good lesson for me in the beginning of my own path to understanding human rights, to realize that very smart, good people can have different views about the emphases. And as Graham and Samantha and I continued our study, I learned that some people focus more on civil and political rights. Some people are more concerned about social and economic rights. It dawned on me that every great religion in the world has tenets that do not align with the universal norms of human rights. And therefore, it truly is a challenging policy question. And when human rights policy collides with other policies, human rights and national security, or human rights and the environment, there's unanswered territory. As David mentioned recently, I've been doing a little bit of work on the environment. How do you address the rights of native people to live on their land and to use that land as they see fit? as that collides with environmental catastrophe that we're having in this century, loss of species and loss of habitats? These are tough questions. So to make a long story short, thanks to the support of Joe Nye, we did launch the Human Rights Center here. And I couldn't be more pleased after 10 years at the extraordinary work that's been done by these three, by Michael Ignatieff, and by many more. And I look forward to the next 10 years. And I'm grateful to the school. I don't think there could have been a better place for me to make a contribution, and I'm certain that the Carr Center has advanced human rights throughout the world. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator tonight, Rory Stewart. He's the Ryan Family Professor of the Practice of Human Rights, and he is the director of the Carr Center. Rory is the founder and chief executive of the Turquoise Mountain Foundation, dedicated to the regeneration of the historic commercial center of Kabul, Afghanistan. He earned his BA and MA at Oxford. He served as an officer in the diplomatic service, and as I think most people know, he walked 6,000 miles across Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Nepal, and wrote about it in his famous book, The Places in Between. He was awarded the Order of the British Empire by the British government in 2004. He's written for the New York Times, for the London Review of Books, and we're lucky to have you. So, Rory.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much indeed for coming. And it's wonderful to see so many friendly and familiar faces in the audience. I'm going to turn it over to Samantha and to Sarah, who were there from the very beginning of this organization, to reflect on two things. To reflect on the history of the Carr Center, but also to reflect on the changing landscape of human rights over the last 10 years, and maybe point us forward to the next 10. And since it's really very much their creation and their show, I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Samantha at this point.
Thanks, Rory. I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting some oratory, some ode to human rights. But that you've saved that for later. It's great to be here. I now work in government, and so I haven't met anybody who doesn't work in government in a really long time. So it's especially great to look out and see former students and fellows and the incredible staff of the Carr Center, and to be reunited with colleagues, and of course with Greg and Sarah and Rory and the Carr Center family. I was just, in looking out at the various people who've played different roles in the life of the Carr Center, I was thinking kind of what unites Greg and Graham and Sarah and Michael and myself and Rory, and maybe one word would be impatience, a kind of restlessness and impatience, a desire to understand, yeah, okay, but if everybody agrees, this is sort of what Greg was saying, that these people shouldn't suffer in these ways, and the principles should guide behavior, state behavior, individual behavior. So why isn't it working? Why are there all these gaps? I think there's also a common sort of evidence-based approach. A desire to see real results. Also an impatience, I think, internally about the center and what we're achieving. I mean, Greg was saying that we hope human rights in the world are just a little more protected, a little more promoted, a little more respected, because the center's been around. I think we'd all, love to see the political scientists tracking this. I mean, I think none of us take that for granted, and really continue to ask those questions about whether or not we're making the impact that we seek in the lives of real people, real individuals, real communities, and not just in terms of op-eds and books and things like that. Greg, was a great visionary, remains a great visionary, as you can see, with that restlessness as he goes from having been a visionary and giving rise to this, to the work that he's doing now, which is just remarkable. and that he and Graham found one another initially while Greg was a student here at the Kennedy School, where Graham made the wise decision to invest in a harebrained scheme Greg had, which was something about inventing voicemail or something like that. And Graham was like, that sounds like a good idea. And Greg went off to the races, and we all hate voicemail now with equal conviction. But we love human rights a little more. And Greg is always a visionary. He always sees something that the rest of us have a hard time seeing. Graham is the person within this institution who, above all, knows how to get things done and is so driven and so relentless, indefatigable around the dreams that he has for this school, for this institution, for students and faculty and others, and really has helped build this faculty, this whole place, this room, in fact. So it's great, Graham, that you're here with us as the kind of founding shepherd of this within this institution. And David Elwood, of course, has been a great friend to the center since he became dean, and even has the center prominently lodged in his talking points as he describes with pride what the school is doing, which is really important. Now, going back to when we came into existence, Graham, you'll correct this story if it's inaccurate. It's now the stuff of urban legend, so I'm not sure how much success you'll have correcting the story. But our understanding was that when you informed some of your colleagues at the Belfer Center that you were going to create a human rights policy center at the Kennedy School, that the response of one prominent colleague of yours was, well, we already work on loose nukes. Now, what's the harm? We'll have loose kooks. So we promptly went out and made T-shirts that said loose kooks on the back, and we were determined in our insurgent role to try to mainstream the consideration of human rights here, and again, had many friends in that enterprise, including many faculty who were part of the Carr Center's advisory committee throughout. We've come a long way. I mean, the number of you who are here today, the number of you who flock to Rory's classes and Sarah's classes, and the cases that appear in Graham and other faculty. You see Arthur Applebaum and others who, I mean, human rights policy and the questions that drove the creation of the center are completely mainstreamed within the school. When we go back to 1999, Rory asked us to reflect a little bit on the changing landscape. It's again hard to remember this now, but we were looking at intervention, the use of force, specifically U.S. military intervention in Kosovo, which occurred in that year, the first year of the Carr Center's existence. You heard a lot of talk about the sole superpower. As we discussed sort of policy options for governments and how they would interact with abusive governments, the policy of isolation seemed then a very viable possible policy tool. And in the sense that there was such an eagerness to interact, in terms of trade and foreign direct investment and socially with the United States, that tool, even though a blunt instrument always, was one that was oft discussed in these corridors. You had, of course, the permanent members of the Security Council and challenges in finding consensus around how to enforce human rights principles, how to enforce peace and security more broadly. But it was the case, by and large, that if the United States really, really cared about something, it was often able to bring other countries around. This was 1999, again, not that long ago. Interestingly, in 1999, we defined ourselves still, I think, as living in the post-Cold War world. So even though it was 10 years after the fall of the wall, that was still the kind of defining conception was retrospective rather than forward-looking. Today, here we are, 2009. Now, I guess we're more prone to the degree that we define ourselves around an event. It's 8 years since September 11th. Although I think there's more of a recognition now about global challenges, global interdependence, and the demands that those place on institutions, on countries, on individuals. When the Carr Center was created, we, and again, both Greg and Dean Elwood have sort of alluded to this, but it was very deliberately called the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. The idea was, it wasn't just for human rights, it was really to try to teach and to learn and to grow and to learn also crucially from students who were coming from policy roles inside and outside of government. But what makes institutions tick? How do you explain these gaps between promise and practice? And how can those gaps be filled? Like, let's do the analytics on that. We also, I think none of us who were involved right from the beginning were traditional human rights specialists. I had been a journalist in the Balkans. Sarah was coming from the Clinton administration where she'd worked at the Pentagon. Michael was an author and a writer. And I think that informed the way we looked at human rights. It wasn't so much looking at legal norms and treaties, and it wasn't rights as sort of a narrow rights-based approach, but it was, in a sense, a center created to look at human welfare and how human suffering could be reduced. And so the questions that we asked were very rooted in what the president, hearkening back now to FDR, would have called freedom from fear and freedom from want. How do you maximize the degree to which civilians can, innocents and citizens abroad can live free from fear and free from want? And why, despite all the rhetoric, again, do things sort of lag behind? I think, again, 10 years after the creation of the center, to get back to the landscape, we now have emerging powers who are so central to the course of human history. We have that same Security Council and some of the same dynamics, but within multilateral institutions, which are, of course, demonstrably crucial for dealing with global challenges, there are very different conceptions of where human rights fit in and how they should be integrated into the promotion of stability and security. I think what's incredibly gratifying for me is the degree to which now in serving in government, some of the questions that I think probably even just 10 or 15 years ago that would have been a feature of policy discussion. Why are we even talking about human rights? Why, what does this have to do with, geopolitical discourse? Those questions are not asked. There are, of course, questions about trade-offs. There are questions about sequencing. But you only have to look at the last decade to know the degree to which the abuse of human rights or neglect of human rights in the conduct of policy, in fact, have very deleterious effects when it comes to our interests. Now, the bigger challenge that remains a challenge as to how to balance these equities, but a major challenge now, especially as we conceptualize human rights as broadly as we do in terms of human welfare, is how do you move not just American machinery, but the international machinery around such challenges as climate change, as nuclear nonproliferation, as preventing mass atrocity, as enhancing food security and ensuring that people have access to basic needs. Given some of the divisions in the international system, what we need is not just a consensus that human rights and human welfare are a priority, but really a consensus around the tools toward getting to the outcomes that we want. And that's, I think, where work still has to be done. And that's what's gratifying about seeing already just in the year that, or not even a year that Rory has been here, but the direction that the center is going in is keeping up, as it always, I think, has with the times and with the dilemmas that are central on the global policy stage.
Sarah.
Thanks, Rory. When I think back to 2000, which is when I came to the center, and I think about the specific question that you asked, Rory, which is, how have the questions changed? I'm not sure that the questions have changed. In other words, I think that the questions for human rights are still, what are human rights? How do you best go about promoting them? At what cost do you go about promoting them? I think within that, the center has always had a more narrow niche, which is really just building on what you were saying, Sam, which is to say that we didn't want to be, very few people who have been central to the center's work have really focused on the question of defining rights and have really thought more about how do you achieve some semblance of them, measured in quite concrete and material terms having to do with human welfare. And so while we have not been driven by a desire to define the norm that we're promoting, we've been driven by questions of action and impact in terms of thinking about how do you galvanize multifaceted attention to a problem and achieve it. And I think, when I came to the center, I didn't consider myself a human rights person. I didn't wear that normative label. I was a national security person. My background was in foreign policy. I'd spent over a decade in public service in US foreign policy, and then as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon, never conceiving of myself as wearing a human rights hat. But in all of the work that I had done, both in public service and then on international justice after leaving Washington and doing a book on the ICC up the street, in fact, I was principally concerned with questions of very concrete human impact. So I came to the center with a sense that the human rights label, qua label, could be detrimental to the human rights impacts that we were seeking. And I was really gratified that the center was a place where I could bring national security questions and sensibilities to questions about human impact. So a lot of what I've done since being at the center has been to make more ecumenical, if you will, the understanding of human rights and to open that tent to people who, like me before I came to the center, didn't consider themselves to be human rights persons. And so journalists or international lawyers or infantrymen or generals who don't necessarily self-identify as human rights persons come to a collective problem-solving exercise and realize that, in fact, their motivation and, in fact, what they would consider to be a better outcome revolve around human consequences, which some people might, in fact, call human rights. So it's a very surreptitious, almost seditious approach to thinking about what it means to galvanize people toward common ends that have human impacts. And so I think the beauty of that approach is that it may not necessarily always fit a human rights label. And in fact, I've been made quite uncomfortable by people who have argued that in the service of pragmatism and impact, you've corrupted the label of human rights. But at the end of the day, I think it's a defining feature of what it means to get things done. And by way of talking about the center's role and the uniqueness of the center's role, and I think the real brilliance of Greg's decision to give the center a home at a school of public policy, is that much in the way that Dean Elwood has made this a week of public service, the dean and the history of the school has in fact been to support the notion of academia in the service of public policy. So an effects-based approach to human rights has a natural home here in a school of public policy as opposed to in a law school or in a philosophy department. And the kind of work that one is able to do at the center, and my work was early and somewhat lonely in the beginning, and now I have eons of company from people who are doing very different work, but with a similar approach, which is to say, connected to practitioners in the field, connected to very concrete policy problems that are vexing Washington and about which people who serve in public service often don't have time to adequately reflect and think differently about, and the engagement of people who don't normally talk to one another in this collective problem-solving exercise. I can't tell you how much of my work has revolved around uniting elements of the United States government that don't speak to one another, but that when they actually do understand where they have shared motivation and overlapping interests, can be moved to a different point. So the kinds of things that we've been able to do at the center, whether it is providing ethics training to special forces units before they deploy to the field as part of their capstone training exercise, or whether it is helping an Army lessons learned outfit come to grips with checkpoint killings and write an escalation of force manual, or whether it is helping the most senior JAG in the Air Force think differently about his interpretations of international law and whether or not they actually do track with customary practice, or whether he just argues that because it's convenient, or whether it's working on recrafting a counterinsurgency field manual, are all ways that many people would think don't necessarily count as human rights work. But the effects of them as second and third order measures will in fact be with enormous human consequence. And to be at a center that allows you to be both extremely applied and pragmatic, and to not lose sight of the larger, bigger normative questions in which very pragmatic work is nested, is an extraordinary privilege. And then to be leavened by your students and the classroom, and in many cases to involve them in your own work. I mean, one of the wonderful aspects of one of the projects that I started a year or two ago, which is working with military planners to develop a concept of operations for mass atrocity intervention, is that we involved students in that process, many of them national security fellows, and they're now deployed around the world working with their combatant commands to help bring in the work that they initially did in conceptual stage into the actual planning process of the commands. And then another student who runs a company, which in the world that I came from in Washington would be called a Beltway Bandit, will provide pro bono work to do a tabletop exercise to help train people in how to do genocide intervention. And those sorts of synergies that happen from both the schoolhouse to the field, from before students come to the school to while they're here and taking a class, and to them when they go on and do their future work in places that may not at all think of themselves as human rights actors. They become infused with a different sensibility, and the possibilities of change expand enormously. And many of the people who are in this room have been part of that process. And so I would just like to say thank you, Greg, for making it possible for those synergies to exist and for people to think outside the box about making change in ways that may break some crockery and may not fit boxes and expectations, but that ultimately make a bigger difference because of the way they're done.
Okay, well, Samantha asked me to talk a little bit, so I will talk very, very briefly for 5 minutes, just to reflect on some of the themes and then try to put the conversation back to all of you in the room to get your questions coming forward, and to have a little debate with Samantha and Sarah and with all of us on this panel on where we go. I do think the center is a very exciting model for human rights and public service. It was a very important symbolic act to locate a human rights center in a school of public policy. We've been very lucky to have a philanthropist who has been committed, energetic, interested in the subject, but also not a micromanager, happy to step back, happy to let us do some very strange things. Greg has proved in what he does in Mozambique exactly the same qualities that he's brought to bear on the center. I also think it's a center that's done a lot of good, and just perhaps to be unfair to Samantha and Sarah, both of them in their own ways have really done some very exciting things. Samantha, and to some extent Michael, were among the very first to call very strongly for intervention in Bosnia and then in Kosovo. And of course we forget now, 10, 15 years on, that those were controversial, courageous, and difficult calls to make. At a time in Bosnia, of course, when everyone was saying centuries of ethnic hatred, we shouldn't go into the Balkans, there's nothing we can do there, it isn't worth the bones of one Pomeranian grenadier, Samantha was calling for that intervention, and she has been completely vindicated. Right? It is now obvious that she was entirely correct. In the same way, Sarah Sewell's work on the use of force has also been very exciting. It was a very, very risky move to sit down with the US military and to talk to them about rules of war, to talk to them about human rights, to create a safe environment in which the military can sit down with humanitarian agencies to overcome those kind of divisions. And we can see now, in the counterinsurgency field manual, in the comprehensive approach, that it now seems very straightforward to people like General Petraeus in the US military that they should begin to think of themselves as more than fighting machines, that they should think about themselves as engaged in humanitarian activities. Today, this afternoon, I was talking to a Kennedy School graduate who was one of Sarah's students 6 years ago. And he now works with the United Nations in New York, and he's been working on Africa, and he's been working with AFRICOM, the new United States military command in Africa, and trying to get AFRICOM to talk to Médecins Sans Frontières in North Uganda, and is directly referring to Sarah's work in trying to do that. So the themes that we have here, the themes that my two colleagues bring together and that Greg brings together, is something that I think is very central to the school, because it's political philosophy in its best and most active sense. These are public intellectuals who are also engaging in politics, who are engaging in institutions, who are not afraid to take action. And I think if we look forward to the next 10 years, we're going to see a center that's facing challenges which are going to have to draw on their merits. The first of those challenges is going to be in relation to intervention. And so far as we deal with use of force and intervention, 10 years has completely changed the way we look at these things. 10 years ago, 1999, Kosovo, it might have seemed quite obvious after the success in Bosnia that intervention was a good thing. Now, of course, after the experience of Iraq and mired now in Afghanistan, it is far from clear that it is as unambiguously good as it might have appeared then. And we could see that transition with Michael Ignatieff's work as he began to get drawn after 9/11 into disputes on torture, into his support for the Iraq War, which he subsequently retracted. All of that brought all of us, and I was here in the center in 2004, 2005, into difficult discussions about what exactly is the role of the United States. It might have seemed in Bosnia and Kosovo that there was not much conflict between our national security interests and human rights, or at least the actions of our military and our humanitarian objectives. Now we're in a situation in Afghanistan where, frankly, it's not quite clear to us what we hope to achieve, why we're there, what we can do. And from a very narrow human rights perspective, we have drones flying up and down doing things which would have been unimaginable 10 years ago when this center was founded. Been unimaginable in 1999 when we were criticizing the Israelis for assassinating Hamas leaders. Would have been unimaginable 20 years ago that the British government in Northern Ireland would go around using Predator drones with 13 attacks, which is what we had on Massoud, who was recently killed. 13 attacks that killed 200 people to get one man would have been unimaginable in Northern Ireland. Would it be unimaginable that we would have been involved in the kinds of things that we were involved in the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, or that we would be trying to create a 450,000 strong Afghan police and military infrastructure and risk creating military dictatorship in Afghanistan in order to pursue our national security, but also in relation to the Taliban, our human rights objectives of protecting Afghan women. Now, this is not to say that the intervention in Afghanistan is wrong. It may well be the correct intervention, but it raises complex, paradoxical issues on human rights, which we may not have faced 10 years ago. What is the center going to do to address this? Well, I hope it's going to try to address it in different ways. It's going to try to address it optimistically, not just negatively. We have a fellow working with us today who's working on Turkey and the Balkans. Turkey, again, is a 10-year success story. If you look back to 1999, Turkey looks a bit gloomy. In 1999, 3,000 villages have just been destroyed in a fight against the PKK. Thousands of people have disappeared and been murdered. Women are treated very badly. 10 years on, we now have a situation in which torture is outlawed, the Turkish police are behaving in a much more constructive fashion, and women's rights in Turkey have been transformed in relation to divorce, marriage, property. But this has happened not through a military intervention. It hasn't happened through sanctions. It's happened through the European Union, particularly. A carrot, not a stick, which has convinced the entire Turkish deep state to change its activity and operations. How do we address this, address these challenges? Well, I think perhaps drawing on the precedent that Samantha, that Graham, that Sarah, that Michael, and that many of us in this room, I mean, that there are so many people in this room that we should be thanking. So many very, very strong people, not just of our affiliated faculty who are sitting in the front row, but also our staff, whether this is people like Suzanne, or Christina, or Sim Rozovsky, or Chris, or going back, also in the room, Jim Fleming, who I can see here, or Hilary Schrenel, all these people here who built the center, looking at it, I think, in three ways. Firstly, continuing to focus on the concepts and the methodology of human rights, which are going to be absolutely central, the work that Matthias Rieser does so impressively in our center, which is to ask, what are human rights? How can they be justified and disputed? The work that Andrea Rossi does on measurement. What is the kind of evidence we gather when we make a claim about human rights? Secondly, moving away from an era in 1999 when human rights, coming from the amnesty tradition, seemed to be about facing up to despotic governments, defending prisoners of conscience against the despotic government, towards a world now when we work on human trafficking, where we work on social movements, where we work on migration, the work that Jackie Baba's been doing. Thirdly, to look at specific contexts. Ali Alawi, who's a fellow here with us today, working on Iraq. Fellows like Leonardo Vivas, working on Latin America. Fellows like Gerald Knaus, working on the Balkans. In all these ways, I think we are framing a center which can try to address problems which, as we look forward, could range from interventions that don't involve military force, interventions that may not involve economic sanctions. Human rights in the United States. I'm very excited to have Tim McCarthy here today. He's looking at social movements in the United States, civil rights, human trafficking, which I mentioned. And all of this from a center that remains, and this is where I'm going to shut up, remains engaged very, very directly in politics. Just this week, just to look at our fellows, just a snapshot of this week. Yesterday, one of our fellows, Matt Waldman, was testifying to the Congress Armed Services Committee on Afghanistan. Right? This week, too, Ali Alawi just won the Washington Institute Book Prize for a book on Islam and human rights, looking at the philosophy of human rights. And this is not just fellows and faculty. This week, too, Tyler Moselle, who's a member of our staff, will have an article published in the Financial Times on counterterrorism and human rights this Friday. All of this reflects a center created by these two people on my left, created by Greg, supported by Graham, supported by David, which is about action. And that's very much, I think, a theme which we can connect to public service and to all of you in this room. So on that note, rather than me continuing to speak, having fulfilled what Samantha asked me to do, I'm going to open it up to you. I'd like you to ask some questions. I'd like maybe if you could gather a few questions, and then we could give them to Samantha and Sarah, and they could have a chance to answer you and address some of these issues. So maybe we're going to start with Elliot. Right.
Hi. My name is Elliot Presley-Freeman. I'm an MPAID student here, and very interested in what we talked about tonight about the potential political implications of human rights, and to push that a little bit more. And if we push that as human rights not really being very universal, but rather emerging out of a specific historical moment and a Western conception of the right and the good, we can see how it's wielded to do some things that tend to serve the Western interest. Human rights becomes activated in the Taliban's Afghanistan, Saddam's Iraq, but not so much in the occupation of Iraq, for instance, or Palestine and the cultural demolition therein. So the question becomes, how are human rights wielded as a semiotics, a language of power, that can be the thin edge of an imperial wedge? And what are the consequences of ourselves as a center being involved so closely with American power that can be doing some pretty nasty things sometimes?
Thank you, Elliot. Great question to begin with.
That was Rory's plant.
Beautiful, yes.
Except that Rory has the Imperial Order medal.
Others?
Can we have some more? Let's gather 2 or 3, and then we'll address them all at once. Volunteers? People in the audience? No, all right, we'll start. Yeah, go on, Ben. Yeah.
I'll start out with a predicate, and it's a 3-word question. Curtis LeMay, the former Allied strategic bombing commander over the Pacific, was once asked in an interview what war was, and he said, I take it he was talking to a journalist, and he said, young man, I'll tell you what war is. You've got to kill people, and when you kill enough people, they stop fighting. And then he went back to chomping on his cigar. In this Sunday's New York Times, Dexter Filkins, former Carr Center fellow, I believe, was in a meeting with General McChrystal and other commanders among the Allies in Afghanistan. And there was a description of how vexed General McChrystal was about it turned out to be a 500-pound bomb, but originally it looked like a Predator strike on a house that quite possibly contained civilians. Obviously, this is a quantum leap in terms of American warfighting, and I think you guys deserve a lot of credit for that evolution. But the question is, and this is the three-word question, will it work? Will it win us the war in Afghanistan? So I'll leave it there.
Okay. But who's gonna, oh, you got a question? Great. We got a third question. We'll stop at 3.
Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Rubenstein, Northeast Director of Amnesty International. One thing that concerns me about the center is there's so much emphasis on, when we talk about human rights policy, it's America's human rights policy. And for Samantha, who's now working in National Security Council multilateral affairs, we always knew, after all, the Soviets had a human rights policy, and it was detrimental to human rights. But in today's world, does Brazil have a human rights policy? Does India have a human rights policy? It has a direct impact, say, on the crisis in Burma, and it is a democratic ally of sorts of ours. What is China's human rights policy? It is much more involved in the world. How can we nurture China in a more human rights direction, not just through pressure, but by creating a human rights lobby inside China when there's no domestic human rights policy lobby inside China on China's own domestic affairs? So the challenge is developing a sympathetic human rights policy on the part of both the natural allies and perhaps some competitors we have in the world as well, so that our efforts reinforce each other instead of competing against each other.
I'm Alex Palmer. I'm a sophomore at the college. And my question is about human rights and American interests. Professor Powers was talking about how the Balkans, maybe that was a good example of when our interests are in tune with human rights, that it is best for us and for the world for us to intervene. But I'm wondering specifically about Afghanistan, where we've seen President Obama, he said, I think 6 cabinet-level meetings now, trying to decide what's the best strategy for American interests. And perhaps it wouldn't be best for us to stay, but I think we'd all like to think that the best thing for at least human rights and women in Afghanistan would be for America to stay. So I'm wondering how you guys approach that question when perhaps American interests and human rights don't match up, and which one trumps here, and how you reconcile that.
Great. Okay, let's take a last one, and then we'll get on to the questions.
My name is Jake Sloan. I'm a sophomore at the college. And I was just wondering what you guys thought has been kind of the greatest success of the Carr Foundation in dealing with human rights issues in the past 10 years.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay.
I can try to start, I guess, on a few of these. First, I think Sarah tried to address the charge, kind of preemptively a little bit, that the human rights discourse and this kind of engagement can be, I forget how you put it, but a veneer or something for imperial power. I mean, our logic from the beginning was that the U.S. government, and I'll get to Josh's, I think, very important question in a minute, but just since you asked specifically about the United States, that the U.S. government is involved, engaged, every minute of every day in some fashion with the other 191 countries in the United Nations. And given the concern for human welfare and freedom from fear and want and human rights and human dignity, it was clear to us that there was a need for engagement with those actors that are involved with those countries every minute of every day of the year. Now, I think had we done that appraisal initially, just, initially Greg and Graham and me, and then Sarah and others, and discovered that there were organizations or institutions that were already involved in that engagement, already trying to ensure that human consequences were more forcefully factored into the highest level of decision making, then again, with this sort of restlessness and this impatience and this evidence-based approach, I think we would have said, great. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do, but if you care about the results, and I recognize there are different views about whether this center should be doing it, because some people don't want to be around the place where that kind of work is being done. But I think we are better off in a world where those kinds of engagements occur than one where they don't occur. And if nobody else is doing them, we felt it was our responsibility, again, with an eye to the people who we were trying to keep focused on, to take up that challenge, recognizing that it would not be popular everywhere. And Sarah may want to say a word or two more about that. On Josh's excellent question, I was trying to get at that a little bit in my comments. I mean, the center has been U.S. policy focused. I think to some degree, like many of the centers here, we are the sum of the expertise of the people who comprise the institution. So while I think it's certainly a fair critique of the first part of my work before I began working on the UN itself, and certainly fair to say about Sarah, given the work that she's done with the U.S. military, I think if you look at the work of the fellows who have been brought in, we're a composite at the center. Does our work, get more attention in the United States? Yes, but have we made a genuine effort to bring in people from all around the world who are going to bring what they do and learn and produce here back to their societies? Yes, but I think you're asking a question that's as much about the world as it is about the center, and God forbid, given that we're having this sort of discussion tonight about the center and public service. But look, it's very, very challenging to engage some of the emerging powers on these issues. I think what we are trying to do as a government now is never losing sight of the ball, eye on the ball, but trying to be creative about how those conversations occur, the form that those dialogues take, sometimes the language. I mean, it's a little bit a version of Sarah's point about, I guess, engaging sort of unlike-minded individuals, but also in untraditional ways. So again, you'll see President Obama, in all of his speeches, he views human rights and democracy as so foundational, as so central. Specifically, I would draw you back to the speech at the UN General Assembly, that it's in order, it's both an end in itself and it's instrumental. Until you have societies in which the people have a say in how they're governed and in the policies of their governments, the odds of us being able to make the kind of progress we need to make, on climate change. I mean, how are you going to get societies to move on climate change unless citizens are involved in the solution? On Middle East peace, how, in fact, are people going to be brought along, and are spoilers going to be so marginalized that you have enough of a society consensus? It's ultimately going to be through democratic dialogue and democratic processes. So, I think that what we try to do is, and what the president especially tries to do as he engages, look at the difference between the Cairo discussion and the discussion in Accra and the discussion more broadly at the General Assembly, is try to find ways of talking about traditional principles in a sufficiently fresh way that you can get a hearing. Because there is a conception that human rights, in some countries, a conception that human rights has been a cover for other things. And as we try to engage anew over a set of shared challenges, and recognizing that we need democratic partners and a critical mass of countries within international institutions to take leadership on these issues, working on both a bilateral basis to get more of a consensus around how we do this together, so that then bears fruit in multilateral fora, rather than showing up in multilateral fora, talking about what we want and expecting people to come along. I mean, I think that's a critical difference, is to reach back into capitals and try to find ways to engage and bring untraditional partners into this. And there's a lot of the rights language, again, in some societies isn't going to work right now. But there's certainly a strong interest in conflict prevention, in civilian protection, in stability. There are other ways to get at it, but these dialogues always end up in the language of human rights. It just may be that you need several steps en route in order to create the trust that you need to have a more constructive dialogue. So we're just trying a lot of new ways to respond to what is a fundamentally altered international setting in which to be promoting human rights and democracy. I mean, both because of the rise of emerging powers and because of some of what's gone on over the last 8 or 10 years. So, Sarah, do you want to?
Well, I think building on one piece of that, we also don't want human rights language to get too divorced from power, because at the end of the day, power is not unimportant in the international system, and the question about human rights being instrumental needs to be parsed much finer than as it was posed. We need to ask, well, which rights, for whom, and how would they then be promoted? America has been pro-human rights in some ways since its founding. It just did it in an exemplary way rather than with a forceful approach. And sometimes a forceful approach will be justified. We can see Bosnia as one example of that. And in other cases, it may actually not work and therefore may not justified on those grounds as opposed to not normatively justified. So I mean, it's a complicated formula to think about what human rights are and how the rhetoric of human rights and the rationalization of human rights is used. I think in some ways, as much as multilateralism was set back by the US invasion of Iraq, human rights language was also compromised by the invasion of Iraq and some of the subsequent justifications that were used. And so there are many reasons to be cynical, and there are many reasons to be questioning, and it's right to question. Those are not new phenomena in international politics, and those exist for any normative claim. I think what's really interesting to me is the ways in which countries have increasingly come to be judged by human rights criteria, whether or not it's called that. And the reference to General McChrystal and his concern about civilian casualties, which is quite real. And in fact, I'm just putting together a multi-combatant command survey to go into Afghanistan for some field work to assess the recent changes that they've put into place and to make recommendations not just about how to strengthen civilian protection in Afghanistan, but how to do it more institutionally throughout the US military in much the same ways that we used the Coin Doctrine. But the question there is that for General McChrystal, human rights are instrumental, right? That's the point about the counterinsurgency field manual, is that they are related to your power, they are related to your ability to get things done, and there's this wonderful happy thing that happens when, in addition to serving your interests, they're actually the right thing to do. That's win-win. And there are lots of circumstances like that out there that need to be found and exploited and defined and have people pushed toward. So I'd like to think that, in no small part, we were contributing to that phenomenon, but the question that the gentleman asked at the microphone, which is, will it work? Well, that's a different question. Will it work? Efforts to reduce civilian casualties, we can find ways to make those work. Does that mean that the US approach in Afghanistan will work? Well, as Rory said, it depends in part on what it is that you're trying to do. If you see the conflict in Afghanistan as being one about promoting women's rights, that's a very different way of looking at Afghanistan than if you see our presence in Afghanistan as being a way to sustain pressure on a safe haven for terrorists in Pakistan. Those are fundamentally different ways to think about the problem. And the ways in which you think about modulating your presence, and whether your purpose is to actually increase rights or whether your purpose is to gain enough legitimacy to stay there for your own ulterior motives which lie outside the boundaries of the country, totally different questions. So will it work depends in part for what would it work. I think I'll stop there.
Just to come in briefly on the question of what the center should be most proud of. I mean, it's a very, very difficult thing to say, but at least since I was not involved, maybe I can come in and give a stab at it. I actually think that the center should be very proud of its attempt to, if we take on from Samantha's talk about impatience and what that implies about action and what Sarah says that implies about power, and it's unfair to choose one thing, but I would be very, very proud of the stance that it took in relation to Bosnia and Kosovo and the important role that it played in framing those debates. I think that in a world where we're getting very disillusioned about the possibility of international intervention in power, Bosnia is just a very cheering example. It's an example where the crime rates in Bosnia are now lower than they are in Sweden. Right? A situation in which the refugee return, which everybody predicted was impossible really when this center was founded 10 years ago, has been a remarkable success. 230,000 people returning to their homes in a year. And if we open it up also to the question about other powers and their action, that also I think is something that connects to the experience of the Balkans and to what the center maybe contributes. We do have people, I'm very excited, young Jian Li is here in the audience, who's one of our fellows who's a Chinese dissident. And the fact that we do have a fellow from China, from Lebanon, from Iraq, that we are a center here that tries to bring people from different parts of the world to challenge some of our assumptions is very important. And I think to come back to banging that drum of Bosnia and banging that drum of Turkey, one of the things I think that we are finding is that change in other countries is not necessarily any more about US power. It may be, as it was in Bosnia and Turkey, to do with something like the European Union. I mean, the great success of the European Union, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from Estonia to Bulgaria, has been to provide some of the context, some of the incentive structure, not the stick but the carrot, which can draw countries into a very different human rights reality, and maybe in a less, perhaps, manipulative fashion, and in a fashion that owes more to medium-sized powers than it does to great powers. But anyway.
Maybe I'll just comment on that as well. Since it's a nice softball, we went for the hard questions. I think that what's amazing, I'd say a couple things. One, we remember just having these discussions right at the beginning about how do we mainstream this? How do we not just end up, initially we were over actually at the Charles Hotel, so we were in University Place. We weren't physically here while we got something, those architects to come in and fix up the space. But how do we avoid just being a little self-contained unit, silo, in which we have conversations with ourselves about how important it is to mainstream human rights? And I think on that score, we've been really successful. And that has a little bit to do with us and a lot to do with the hospitable climate here at the school. I mean, I think,
the students,
and yeah, well, I want to say a word about the students and to see, cases that are developed by fellows taught in leadership classes or taught, to see Sudan or Rwanda, taught in Graham's class, or Arthur's work, using some of what Sarah has done, or, Jackie's work turning up in other people's syllabi. And so, I mean, I think that's a really important piece of this, because there are lots of people who aren't going to come in looking for human rights courses, but the sensitization around human consequences, I think, is essential at a public policy school. And then the second thing I just wanted to mention is the students, which is, what I would turn what would otherwise be a cliche a little bit into a very telling story about my Samantha Power Goes to Washington, which is what's amazing is where, everyone says this, where students turn up, in these incredible places doing such incredible work. And because I think we all try to teach in a fashion that actually equips students to be making arguments in real life policy settings, again, whether for NGOs or back in their own countries or in governments or intergovernmental organizations, it's really gratifying to hear sort of, whether what we've done in the classroom has prepared students. But I must say now that I'm in government, it's especially gratifying to see students who are now working for particular senators, who call up wanting to talk about pieces of legislation. But my Samantha Power Goes to Washington story, which is not yet, I've never told this story to anybody other than my husband. I don't think I told you. It's a deeply embarrassing story, so you'll bear with me. But I happen to be all long from the Bosnia days, very good friends with Richard Holbrooke, who's our AFPAC special representative, or whatever they, special advisor, special representative. And I had a baby since I left here. Yay, baby, yay. and went on maternity leave, and came back to the office and saw Richard in Washington a fair amount, just around the baby. He's not a big baby guy, but I inflicted my child upon him several times. But I was back at work for a few weeks, and he had been in Afghanistan and Pakistan for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, and so I hadn't seen him, and so it was the first time I'd sort of been at the White House, and suddenly I spotted Richard walking in through the West Wing doors, and he's my friend, and I'm a sort of tactile person and a little animated, as has become evident over the years. And I saw him, and I said, "Hey!" And I went running, bursting through the doors, and I just gave him an enormous hug, as I would if I had seen him on the street unexpectedly. But I was actually in the West Wing of the White House, so it wasn't probably the most appropriate way to greet a senior official. And he treated me as if I were a bag lady, and just stood sort of stiffly, and I was kind of like, was, a little bit high five and, nothing, but I was, kind of, and then I looked to my left, and I realized that he had been deep in conversation with Ram at the time that I had sort of burst through so I kind of peeled myself off his chest and moved beyond him out to the daylight, the color of the great Harvard crimson napkin before me. And who did I see as I walked through the door, so totally horrified by this encounter with Ram that I would not live down, but a former student who is now Richard Holbrooke's special assistant, Kimberly McClure. And I said, I didn't recognize her initially because I was so horrified. I said, I just done this horrible un-Washington thing. You're not allowed to hug people in buildings. And I just did. And Ram was there. And Kim said, "Professor Power, it's me. Your class changed my life." And I was like, okay, this, thank you. Never has a Kennedy School student been more strategically placed at just the right time. And she is now, again, Richard Holbrooke's special assistant. So that was my thank you, students, for what you go on to be and the precise placement at times of great vulnerability.
I'm afraid we're close to running out of time, but I'd like to ask one last question, so maybe please come forward.
Yes, I'd like to ask Professor Power to speak a little bit about her experience in government now and so close to the center of American power and a center of global power while crisis persists in Darfur.
Yeah. Well, in general, maybe I'll just say a word about what it's like to transition from here to there more broadly, and then speak about Darfur. I mean, I still have that kind of evidence-based approach to sort of what I do and what we're doing. I'm the Senior Director for Multilateral and Human Rights, and we have a small team. The NSC is a very flat structure, so a lot of what we do is interact with people elsewhere in the government, at the State Department, the Defense Department, and US-UN specifically because of the multilateral. So I have a lot of encounters with Ambassador Rice. And I think that asking that question, what good am I doing? What difference is being in the government making for real people? That's a question that I try to keep asking. Before I went into government, I had, in January, just before starting, I had dinner with Strobe Talbot, who's the head of the Brookings Institution, and he warned me that being, especially at the NSC, but any place really in government, would be like squaring off against one of those tennis ball machines, that's just like, so you're back and forth, and that the danger would be that you sort of admire your, topspin forehand on hitting back a tennis ball, but you're sort of, losing sight of the bigger picture, and whether that's the president's agenda or the human rights agenda or how to enhance global cooperation within multilateral institutions. And so in my little shop, and it will be great to come back here and to be back in the classroom and thinking through what the ways are going ahead of time to ensure that we're equipped to sort of be as deliberative as we can be amid this drinking from a fire hose that one does in government. But we do pull back and ask, the question somebody asked, what are you most proud of? I mean, I make the people that I work with ask that question. It's oddly not a question that's asked that often. I don't know if you found that. But like it's a little bit like hugging people in the halls. Like you don't say, what are you most proud of? Or what did you do this week, that made a difference? So I think continuing to ask that question is very important. And trying to maintain a strategic agenda amid tactical whirlwinds, again, is very, very important. To be able, because in the foreign policy, to move something substantially takes time, and it takes a lot of patience, in fact, for meetings and for dialogue and so forth, just within your own government. Whereas the tactical, there's always email coming in, there are always cables coming in that you've got to field in the moment. So just keeping your eye on what is ultimately going to represent a meaningful shift that will make a meaningful difference is really important. The thing that I find the hardest, and then I'll get to Darfur, is being, I was a journalist and a professor, and I was always in the field. I tried to be in the field, as it were, as much as I was here in the classroom or at the computer. And when I go overseas, everything is much more scripted. I used to just get off a plane and there was no one there, and that creates its own headaches. But now, to be free to just go and ask the questions you want to ask, that it's just very, very different. What's great about it is you come and you inherit all this incredible expertise. These people who've been living in the country for many, many years, and I love being part of a team. I mean, it's one of the things I loved about being at the Carr Center, and now to be part of this bigger enterprise. It just that part of it is very appealing. But again, you have to then take a step back and move away from what you're reading in the black and white print on the page, and try to remember the individuals who are represented in the black and white print on the page, and it's very important to do that. And then on Darfur, I mean, we had a meeting this week because we unveiled our Sudan policy, and we sat down, General Gratian, who's our special envoy for Sudan, Michelle Gavin, our senior director for Africa, and myself, Gail Smith, who is the senior director for development, but is also one of the founders of the so-called Enough Project, one of the leading advocate groups. And I'd be lying if it wasn't strange to be on this side of the table describing our policy and looking out at all the people I used to be on these panels with here at the school, yelling about the Bush administration's policy on Sudan. So it's just strange because your colleagues and your friends and people you've been, in my case, been to Sudan and discovered mass graves with, in the case of John Prendergast, now on the opposite side of the table yelling at me and challenging our policy. So that's strange, but I feel very good about where the policy is and the strategy that we're putting in place. I mean, I come back to a comment I made at the beginning. I think there might be a little confusion out there about era of engagement, which the president has talked a lot about. But era of engagement, it's engagement for what purpose in this instance? Era of engagement in order to stop genocide, atrocity, crimes against humanity in Darfur, and to ensure that there is no renewed conflict and a peaceful solution for South Sudan. I mean, that's what the engagement is about. And back to Josh's question about multilateralization, this plan has us in a much stronger position to go to other countries now and try to get buy-in on the front end, saying there are these two paths that the Sudanese government can take. There is a path, toward engagement that will lead, to less isolation and so forth. But these things have to happen for that to happen. And then there's a path of disincentives, with the clock ticking as these deadlines approach, specifically around South Sudan, and as people continue to suffer in Darfur. And so I feel we're in a strong position now to go multilateralize this strategy, which is going to put us in a stronger position than to actually have impact on the government of Sudan, which is what it's all about. So, okay.
This has been a very exciting moment for us. What we don't want this to end on is a sort of general pat on our back and self-celebration, which to some extent this is in danger of being. As you can see from the questions posed by Elliot, or posed by Josh, or posed by Ben, this is still an area where we are confused. We do not have all the answers. It's very difficult for us to tackle these kinds of problems, whether it is what to do about human rights abuses by emerging powers, whether it is what we make of the abuse of human rights by imperial powers, what we do about the ways in which we are co-opted and drawn into these things. So I would say if we were going to leave with two slogans, the first is to take a slogan from Michael Ignatieff, and we owe him, the three of us, a great deal, and it's a great pity that he isn't on the stage with us today. He liked to quote Gramsci, and he would talk about the center as being a place that epitomized a combination of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. It's a very good slogan. But I think we're also a university center. We're also a center that has to accept that we don't have all the answers, and often we are in very problematic moral positions, and that we are often groping our way, that all we can really offer you are hints followed by guesses. So with that, I will finish with a line from a great Harvard man, T.S. Eliot, who said, "The only wisdom is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless." Thank you all very much indeed.